Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. My name's David Eaves, and today I want to be talking to you a little bit about what are some of the drivers that are causing governments to look at why they're engaged in digital transformation, and what are some of the kind of big strategies, particularly around the use of digital public infrastructure to make that transformation happen. So in today's class, I want to do three particular things. First is I want to talk about the finances behind digital government and what's driving a desire to make change. Then I want to talk about this notion of kind of digital public infrastructure and how governments are using it to make the change happen inside them. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the individual responsibilities that we have in order to make this change happen. Before I get any further, maybe just say a few words about me. As I mentioned, my name's David Eaves. I'm a professor at University College London, where I teach on digital transformation at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. For the last 10 years, I've been really doing two things. The first is thinking about what's the minimum viable knowledge about technology that public servants need to have in order to be effective in their job. And then I've been looking at governments around the world and how they're using technology and trying to transform themselves for the digital era. And that's really caused me to think a lot about digital public infrastructure, and in particular look at the story of India and what it's done. So my background is I've spent a lot of time thinking about open data and open innovation. I spent a lot of time thinking about governments and how they work. And then actually I've done a lot of time also on strategy and negotiation, because it turns out there are not a lot of technology problems. There's a lot more problems that humans are having with each other about technology, and negotiation turns out to be a really important skill for figuring out how to drive change into your organization. I've had the benefit of helping all sorts of organizations around the world and a real privilege of working with them. And here's just some of these organizations that I've had the privilege of working with. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's driving some of this change. And so one thing is, to be totally honest, is COVID has had a huge impact on governments around the world and the way they think about how government should deliver services. When the pandemic hit and government said people had to go shelter in place, the very next thing it realized is that it had to deliver services to those people even though they couldn't come into government offices. And so every government around the world started to think about how it was going to use technology in order to better serve its citizens. And so this has been a huge driver. But there's another thing that's been kind of driving some of this thinking, particularly in the global south. And that's the fact that there simply isn't enough money to try to do government the way most governments have been trying. We need a new model for thinking about how we're going to deliver services that's different from the kind of more traditional model that you may see among some of the OECD countries. And to really highlight that point, I like to use some numbers that pulled together from a Gartner study that was done. And it suggested that there's about $700 billion being spent every year by governments on technology. And that seems like a fairly large number. The problem is that number is not equitably distributed. About $600 billion of that dollars is spent in Europe, Australia, North America, and China, and only about $80 billion of that dollars is spent in the rest of the world. So there's this huge disparity in who is spending the money. And so if you kind of look at those two circles, which are done kind of in relative ratio, you can see this big discrepancy. And if you actually broke that down by how much money was being spent per citizen, you'd see those kind of North America, Europe, China, and Australia, Japan are spending about $252 per citizen, and the rest of the world is spending $14 per citizen. And I think one thing that's particularly interesting is I don't think people are looking at those OECD countries and saying they're doing a fantastic job in transforming themselves to a digital era. So they're spending a huge amount of money, and it's not really clear they're getting the types of outcomes that you would want or that you would want to replicate. Meanwhile, there's incredible innovations happening around how to deliver government services in countries like India and Brazil and Estonia that have actually had much, much lower cost points in how they deliver services. And so what I'm particularly interested in and what I want to share with you today is what are some of the lessons that those countries have to teach us. More sobering is if we wanted all of the population that's being, I think, underserved at the moment to get the kind of same level of spend, we'd have to go find $1.4 trillion every year to spend on those citizens. And I just don't think we're going to find that money. So we need to find leaner, more efficient ways to transform ourselves. So that has led to kind of some interesting thought about what would an infrastructure approach to delivering government services look like. And so to do that, I first want to talk about kind of infrastructure in general. And one piece of infrastructure that most people are familiar with is highways. So almost all of you have driven on a road and driven on a highway. And I think one of the things that you kind of immediately understand about highways is they were originally built principally for actually military purpose. And the goal of the highway is to enable the military to transport products around the country. But the genius of highways, the thing that made them in part infrastructure, was that there was a very minimum set of rules that was applied to them that said anyone could use them as long as they conformed to those simple set of rules. So did you have a legal car? Did you have a driver's license? And that's about it. And so that allowed for all sorts of other use cases that were never imagined before to take place on the highways. So highways, they literally helped create commuting, going out with your family to go on picnics on the weekends, drive-in movie theaters, and even more modern kind of notions, like the whole idea that you would have packages that could get delivered to you the next day after you order something online is all enabled because of the fact that we have a highway network that allows the distribution of goods to take place so efficiently. So this is the first thing about highways is it allowed for all sorts of use cases that we'd never imagined to take place because we had a very simple set of rules on who was allowed to use it. The second genius about highways is that when they created them, they didn't reimagine the road from scratch. They built them to be interoperable with regional roads and local roads. So you could use the same car when driving around the city as you could for driving around the state, that you could for driving around the country. So we have this interoperable system that allowed those things to work with each other. And those were all made possible because you had a regulatory regime that regulated what's an appropriate size of a car, what's the appropriate size of a turn in a road, so that people wouldn't get surprised by this. So what you see now is this piece of infrastructure that you're all very, very familiar with, and you can see all of the different layers of that infrastructure that are working together to create this incredible experience. One of the things that is also really magical about infrastructure is it allows different parts of the system to evolve at different speeds. So what you want to enable is some things to evolve very, very quickly and other things to evolve much more slowly. And in the highways, what you're seeing there is cars, for example, are these high variability systems. So every 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years, people are getting new cars. So you actually have this turnover in the cars is quite frequent. Meanwhile, roads are only getting paved every 30, 50, maybe even 100 years, depending on where you're living. So you have the roads that are evolving very, very, very slowly. And yet, when you get a new car, it still works on the road. So you can have these two systems that are evolving at very, very different speeds, yet they remain interoperable with each other. And the reason they're interoperable is because that regulatory layer in the middle, that stable interface that makes sure that there's a set of rules that everybody's following that allows them to work together. So for me, that key parts of infrastructure, again, is a very simple set of rules that allow people to make use of that infrastructure so we can imagine new use cases we had not previously thought of, and a stable interface that allows the different components or parts of the infrastructure to keep evolving, but at different speeds. So if we think about what government looks like today in a digital form, a lot of governments look like this. Every time you kind of think about a government, you can kind of break it down to some simple components. There's the agency that you're looking at, and then there's the applications that it runs, which for me is the services it's delivering, and that could be issuing a driver's license or a passport or registering for an unemployment benefit or getting a food subsidy. That's an application, and I don't really care if that's on a computer screen, over a phone, or writing out a piece of paper. It's an application, it's an activity that the government's doing. And then it has some sort of database, some sort of system of memory that records what benefits did you receive, how long are you eligible for. So if you kind of think about all of the different kind of departments that you might have in your state or in your city or even here across your country, you can think of those different departments, and then for each of those activities or those applications, there's actually similar things that are happening for each of them. So for each one of those, you have to authenticate yourself. You have to, make a declaration that you're David Eaves and be able to prove that. You probably have to tell them what your address is. You might have to provide some other unique identifier to identify that you're you or some other piece of information. And there's almost always a form you have to fill out to collect all sorts of data about you to know if you're eligible for the service or to declare that you're eligible. And no matter what service you're using, we're always doing those same things over and over and over again. And then, of course, that ministry is taking all that information and saving it in their memory system, in their database, and preserving it so that they can either issue the benefit or deny you and have a memory of what they did. When you think about this model and you think about it in terms of the highway example I was just giving, the way governments build services in this way is almost kind of like when if they wanted to build a road from Delhi to Jaipur, they'd build one highway, and it'd make great service, get all the way there, and then they decided they also want to build a road to Jodhpur, and they'd build a whole new highway to it, and it would run parallel to the first highway for the first a couple hundred kilometers before it kind of started to veer away. And if you decided midway you wanted to go to one of the other cities, you'd have to go all the way back to Delhi and then go all the way forward. So we're in government, it's literally like we're building these highways over and over and over again, and for huge stretches of them, they're running parallel to each other because we're effectively doing the exact same thing. So this type of system, the danger here is we get lots of duplication, not a lot of standards across these different services. So our citizens are running into really different websites that have really different looks and feels, really different forms on them that can be quite confusing and even intimidating to someone who is maybe worried about doing something wrong or new at interfacing with government. The one thing it does offer us is really nice accountability. So the very senior managers watching this know, yes, but what's nice is I know exactly who's responsible for everything in the service, and as we like to say in industry sometimes, I know whose belly to poke when I'm unhappy. So I know who to go and yell at when I have a problem. And also we know how to assign budgets in this model. So we know when something's wrong or we want to expand something, we know to assign a budget to that ministry who can then expand the service. So there is some conceptual clarity from an accountability perspective in this model that's very attractive and that I don't want to diminish and I want to recognize. The reality of though is that it's not like ministries only do one thing. If you zoomed in on a given ministry, like say the tax department, they do lots of services, sales tax, income tax, import taxes, all these different things. And each one of those probably have their own sign-on system, have their own address record you have to enter, have their own forms that you have to fill out, and are also storing all of their information on their own unique system inside that ministry. So again, all of this incredible duplication happening inside the ministry all over again. So what does an infrastructure view look like? If we don't build highways in the real world next to each other over and over and over again, and we take an infrastructure view, which is where we're sharing something and we're having lots of purposes built on top of it, what does that look like? Well, what's so interesting is that India has been one of the global pioneers in thinking about it. It and Estonia and a few other countries have really pushed the thinking about how a government could organize itself really differently in a digital era. So if this is the model of building highways over and over again, like these silos, you can begin to think of an infrastructure model where we have some things that are built in a bespoke manner to serve specific goals, but actually a lot of shared pieces that people are reusing in a really efficient way so that they don't have to rebuild things over and over again. Let's go dive into that infrastructure model a little bit and just see what it looks like. So what I would imagine is you could say, there's at the very top of that model, there's like the services that you're offering your citizens. So, getting a driver's license, getting that benefit, those you want to be highly variable. You want to be able to update those services when a new government gets elected or when a new crisis happens, we have to change the service, or maybe just a new policy emerges and we want to make some adjustments. And then at the bottom, there's the data that we want to collect about people and systems and organizations, and that probably evolves much more slowly, but is really the foundation on which all the services and all the work in government we do is based on. And what we really need is that components, that stable interface in the middle that's enabling us to make quick changes and collect things slowly and share them between those two different groups. So when I think about services, I'm thinking about things like paying taxes, getting a passport. Those are the things we want to adapt really, really quickly. When I think about that middle layer, I'm thinking about things like authentication. And that's where, Aadhaar is a great example, or SingPass in Singapore is a really great example, or the Estonian digital identity. These are systems you can use to authenticate yourself into any government service and even some private sector services, so you don't have to remember a username and password across all these different services. And then maybe another one of these would be a payment, like how can the government issue you a payment, or how can you make a payment to government? And rather than having every ministry buy that service from a different vendor, you actually have a simple way of solving this across all of your institutions. And that's where UPI has been kind of an incredible achievement, as they've done this not just for all government institutions across India, but actually for all transactions across India. Another incredible example of that is Pix in Brazil, which has had equal and maybe even greater impact on that economy in moving people off cash and doing cashless work, and has really enabled the government to distribute payments during COVID directly into people's bank accounts like they did here in India. And another example of that would be a data exchange. enabling ministries to share data with each other or with citizens. And I think the DigiLocker here in India is the beginnings of a really nice example of that. Or the Estonian X-Road system that allows government agencies to share data with one another so that anytime a citizen shows up to fill out a form, it's already pre-completed with all the information about that citizen because the form pulled all the data from across the relevant parts of the government to auto-complete it for them. Really interesting approach to sharing data. So these are kind of your shared components that you can imagine that are then leveraging common, what we might call canonical sources of data. So your unique identifier, maybe a registry of all the vehicles and who owns them in the country, a GIS data layer, so we actually know where all the buildings and the streets and the roads are that anyone can pull from and that is hyper accurate, or your healthcare records. We need to think about what are the core data registries that we'd want to have. So again, this is an infrastructure approach where we're offering kind of society-wide, at a minimum government-wide digital capabilities that are really essential to getting services and participating as a member of both society, but also as a citizen in receiving and fulfilling your obligations as a citizen to the government. So I think DPI, this digital public infrastructure, can be a really powerful driver for transformation, something that we've already seen here in India. And governments are taking different approaches to move from that world of silos into this world of infrastructure. Some governments are doing what we call come in high, which is where they come in and first they start to rearrange the website, do things to kind of make it much easier for citizens to interface with the government, even though they're not creating common components or making the data more organized. They're not touching all the big, gnarly back-end systems that you have to deal with. They're just making the websites much easier to navigate. But the theory being that if they do that right, they can build political support and public support to then start to build the shared components, and they can use those to then in turn begin to build out canonical registries of data. And this is what the government is doing in the UK. So the Government Digital Service in the UK built gov.uk, an award-winning website that consolidated services onto one place, made it very, very easy to interact with government, wasn't tackling so much the deeper parts of government, but they've used their success there to begin to go after that. Other governments have also taken this approach. Madagascar has also started to build a single website to really deliver services in a very efficient and easy to use way. So you start to see some governments coming in high. Other governments are what we call coming in low. So they're first trying to organize and all of the kind of core data they're trying to collect and make those sources of truth accessible to lots of parts of government simultaneously to make it much more efficient to share data. And I think this is the real triumph of the Estonians and their system called X-Road, which allows, again, data from across government to be shared with different ministries to make it much, much more efficient to both deliver services and stand up new services. A real triumph of engineering and organizational architecture that the Estonians have managed to achieve. Other governments have a kind of infrastructure first approach or a come in the middle. And I think that's really what the India stack has been, or the digital public infrastructure here, which is UPI and Aadhaar are creating that shared component layer first, not making the services easier, not organizing the data, but then using that to kind of get the different websites and the services to use a single sign-on to make it easier. So starting to make those services easier by harmonizing the shared components of them. And then I think over time what you start to see is a rationalization of data sets as they use particular Aadhaar to figure out what are all the duplicate data sets that we're collecting, and can we begin to rationalize those down to a fewer set that we can better protect and manage. There are some other strategies like land and expand, where some governments are coming in and they're doing this for just one service, like issuing a driver's license. They're building out a better interface, some shared components, and a core data set, and then they're using that to then pivot out and do the next service, the next service, the next service. So there's different strategies for how to accomplish this. But what does this mean for you as an individual public servant sitting somewhere in this incredible country? What do you need to be thinking about? Well, the first is I kind of hope that this model is giving you a framework and language to understand some of the changes that are happening around you so that you can better adapt the work that you're doing to kind of understand the structural situation to figure out how you can better leverage it. But the other thing I would kind of say is I think that as difficult as the accomplishment of the technology has been, it will be the easy part. And what we're really going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about is the governance. Some of this has to do with just kind of the blocking and tackling of how we do work. So I think the demands on the information technology departments in states and cities and other and ministries across this country are going to really change in the next 10 years. Where there's traditional IT functions which are really about making sure the servers are running, making sure the vendors are kept in line, making sure like the attackers are kept out of those systems. Those are all going to continue to be important functions of the IT department, but they're going to have infrastructure thinking views as well, really understanding when they should be leveraging the shared infrastructure that the national government and maybe even regional governments have built, and when they should be building themselves. When should they be using vendors versus when should they be using the shared infrastructure? And how are they going to integrate with it? How are they going to think about the standards, the open source possibilities, how to use these building blocks, maybe build their own building blocks of kind of components they could use across the government, so they start building their own infrastructure that serves their needs. They've got really strategic work that's needing to happen in the IT department that's going to, I think, require some new skill sets and some new responsibilities. Another piece kind of around governance is really beginning to think about how we're going to build trust and safety. I love this chart from a book called The Narrow Corridor that really talks about balancing state power with kind of the public's power. So what you really want to think about here on this y-axis is the state getting more and more power, and if the state gets more power, then it uses its capabilities in ways that can be sometimes oppressive and actually prevent innovation. And the state needs the y-axis, which is the public, to be innovating because it's the public that generates new innovations that the state can use to better deliver services. So the state doesn't invent cell phones, it doesn't invent the internet. It may sponsor and fund those things, but it requires individuals, entrepreneurs, and universities and a whole network of actors to make that happen. And it needs to enable them. But at the same time, if the state is not permitted to make use of those new technologies, it can't deliver services effectively. And so if you have a state that ends up too much on the y-axis, it can actually end up in what we would call a surveillance state, where it's overusing the technology to surveil and it's limiting freedoms and limiting innovations. And if the state is not participating at all and cedes everything to the private sector, then the private sector can end up owning all of these critical systems, and we end up in an extractive model where the private sector is extracting rents because we're all dependent on this infrastructure that it's provisioning. And so the real challenge for us from a governance perspective is how do we avoid the surveillance state, and how do we avoid this extractive private sector model to think of a kind of new inclusive and state governance where we have true infrastructure that is publicly overseen that serves all of society's interests. And that's the big governance challenge that's on our hands at the moment. And that's going to require all sorts of coalition building, whether you're building infrastructure or just using it. And so how are we going to pull together the IT teams, the politicians, the public servants, and civil society to begin to understand where are we helping people, where are we accidentally excluding people, where are we building things that are actually making life more difficult for people. And we've got to figure out how to pull all these stakeholders together and then figure out, what is that window where we can either build DPI or deliver services in ways that are safe, effective, efficient, and inclusive, and that pull everybody together. And I think that's going to require a new kind of form of multi-stakeholder engagement, where we're going to be engaged with the lawyers and the politicians and civil society and the IT department and all the public servants, and really getting the perspectives from all around that table to figure out how we can do this better. And this may even require new governance government systems where we're thinking about who's hosting these systems and how they're delivering them. So in summary, the short version is there's not enough money to replicate, the way the United States is building out its digital government, I think, for the vast majority of the governments in the world, nor is that example the kind of the apex of what we should be doing. We're going to have to find new and creative ways, more scalable and efficient ways of delivering government. And that's going to require some new forms of governance and new forms of thinking. And I think, the capabilities of digital public infrastructure are in some ways inevitable. And this country has really kind of shown a model for how to be doing that. But in order to keep doing it and doing it in a way that builds trust and the way that's safe and secure, is going to require some new coalition building to engage lots of stakeholders so we bring all of society along. Again, my name's David Eaves. This is a little bit of a framework on how digital public infrastructure works and where I think things are going. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope I get to see you again soon.